After being reborn, I couldn't avoid Lance fast enough. When he was going to stay in the hospital, I immediately packed my bags and followed my teacher into the deep mountains for an archaeological excavation. When he said he would bring my sister over, I moved back to the dormitory instead. When he bought the ring, I applied to a school in Beijing City which was far away. In my previous life, he said he wanted to be child-free. However, he took in my stepsister's child and treated it like a treasure. When I was old, the child I had painstakingly raised didn't care about me lying on the sickbed at all and was bent on matchmaking his biological mother and Lance. 01. Seeing that my teacher had personally added my name to the list of the expedition team, I finally breathed a sigh of relief. Just a few days ago, I had refused my teacher's invitation and didn't agree to go with him to the newly discovered tomb site in northern Shaanxi, because the day of my wedding with Lance was next month. In my previous life, in order to stay by his side, I gave up my favorite archaeology major. But nobody expected that it was just such an ordinary expedition that my teachers discovered the largest burial complex of this century. It was also this time that my classmates and teachers had a meteoric rise in the following days, and I, on the other hand, became an ordinary junior high school teacher. However, nobody knew that I had been reborn. Yvonne, aren't you getting married to your fiancé next month? How come you have time to go with us now? Teacher Lee pushed up his glasses on the bridge of his nose and gave me a puzzled look. When it came to Lance, the first thing that came to my mind was his handsome face and the faint smell of disinfectant that always lingered on him. I shook my head. The wedding is postponed for now. I took a deep breath. Anyway, I'm really grateful for the opportunity you've given me again. Thank you. I bowed deeply. The teacher sighed and told me to go back and pack my things, preparing to set off 3 days later. I suppressed my excited mood and left the research institute. 02 In my previous life, I gave up this great opportunity and got married to Lance the next month. He was a doctor who had studied abroad, with a high educational background and fashionable ideas. Due to his original family background, he insisted on being child-free, and he had already told me before marriage. Although I regretted that I couldn't have my own children in this life, I loved him, so I was willing to accept it. Therefore, when my mother said to take in my sister's out-of-wedlock child, I readily agreed. Although Lance didn't want to have his own children, he had always been very kind to this child. I was once very grateful to him. I thought that he loved the child because he loved me. I thought that it was out of love for me that he was good to the child, until the child got married and had children, until I was old. I treated him as my own. But when I was old and fell seriously ill, the false happiness of half of my life was shattered. It turned out that Lance was indeed kind to the child because of his love for someone, but it wasn't because of me, but because of my sister. It turned out that in this life, Lance not only raised my stepsister Yvette's child, but also had been supporting Yvette all along. Yvette didn't need to take care of the child or serve her parents. Instead, she lived a carefree life, spending Lance's money every month, and I was just like a servant who took care of the child and served the parents. Even the child I had painstakingly raised was closer to her. Even when I was old, he tried his best to matchmake Lance and Yvette. I died with deep resentment. Thinking of my previous life when I was so stupid and humiliated, I took a deep breath and walked home. 03 Although the wedding hadn't been held yet, Lance and I had already got our marriage certificate last month. The house was allocated by his hospital, with 2 bedrooms and 1 living room. Shortly after I got home, Lance came back from work, carrying several big bags in his hands. When he saw me, he smiled and said, "There are many colleagues in the hospital. I'm afraid there won't be enough wedding candies. Let's pack more. I'll give everyone a share then." My hands that were sorting vegetables paused, and I gave him a faint look without saying a word. "Go and have a rest. I'll do the sorting." Lance didn't notice my expression. He took my hand and led me to stand up, then he sat on the small stool himself. "Mom said she'll bring Yvette and Eddie here tomorrow. There aren't enough rooms in the house. Otherwise, you can move to my room and let them sleep in the next room." The mom Lance mentioned here was my mother. Yvette was my stepfather's child after my mother remarried. She dropped out of junior high school and started dating. After having a child, the man ran away. My mother advised her to secretly abort the child, but she threatened to kill herself, saying that the child's father would come back, and insisted on giving birth to the child under the juju of others. Eddie was 3 years old now. In my previous life, it was also tomorrow that they came, but only Yvette and Eddie came. Later I learned that it wasn't that my mother wanted to bring her here, but that after hearing that I was getting married, she couldn't wait to bring the child over. Actually, I didn't have a close relationship with her. But I couldn't resist the child's sweet talk, calling me auntie one after another. Plus Lance wanted to be child-free, so gradually I treated Eddie as my own. I shook my head. The past couldn't be undone. 04 Sure enough. The ones who came the next day were only Yvette and Eddie. As soon as I opened the door, I saw that her eyes looked past me and towards the back of me. "Where's brother-in-law? Isn't brother-in-law at home?" Yvette pushed past me, pulling Eddie and barging straight in. He's at work, I said faintly. Yvette put down her things, then turned around and pushed open the door of a room. Sister, which room should I sleep in? Is it this one? The room she pushed open was the door of the master bedroom. That's your brother-in-law's room. She snorted and then pushed open the second bedroom. Then I'll sleep in this room? She casually threw her bundle onto the bed and lay on the bed in a big X shape. Wow, this new bed is so comfortable. After saying that, she paused and said regretfully, however, I like the other room just now better. The window was bigger. Before I could say anything, Eddie tugged at my clothes. Auntie, I'm hungry. Yvette heard this but didn't even look at the child. If you're hungry, go to your auntie. I'm going to take a nap. As if certain that I would take good care of the child, Yvette didn't even change her clothes and fell asleep soundly with my quilt wrapped around her. I frowned. Just as I was about to ask her to get up, Eddie tugged at me vigorously a few more times. Suddenly, I lost my interest. I gave him 2 steamed buns left from breakfast and then went out. 05 I took my identification and went to the dormitory across the street to rent a room. In my previous life, Yvette lived at home for 3 years before moving out. This time, I wanted to see if she would still try every means to stay here now that I had already rented a dormitory room. I sneered and went to buy a few more books. On my way back, I also bought some meat and vegetables before walking home. Before I opened the door, I heard laughter and chatter inside the house. Brother-in-law, look. This is what my sister and I looked like when we were kids. Was my sister really ugly back then? Let me tell you, people in our village all said that if she could continue her studies, she definitely wouldn't have been the first college student in our village. Unfortunately, my mother didn't let me study. Otherwise, I snorted coldly and pushed open the door. Inside the room, Yvette and Lance were very close to each other. Lance was holding Eddie who was eating beef jerky, and Yvette almost threw herself onto Lance. I walked in while carrying the vegetables and said, it wasn't that mom didn't let you study. It's because your grades were so bad. Out of 50 students in the class, you had never ranked higher than 47th. Besides, you dropped out of junior high school and started hanging out with people in society. You didn't even know who the father of your child was. Tell me, with you like this, even if you took the exam, could you get into high school? Yvette's face turned green and then white after hearing my words. Lance put down Eddie and looked at me in confusion. In the past, in order to maintain my image in Lance's eyes, I didn't want to tell him about these messy things in my family. Once he asked me why my sister was raising a child by herself. Before I could say anything, my mother stammered that my sister's husband had passed away. Lance didn't live in our place, so naturally he thought that my sister was a widow. He even once lamented to me that Yvette was pitiful, getting married and having a child at such a young age. I was so blind. Now that I thought about it, maybe what he meant by that lament back then was about my mother. He probably meant that since my mother wasn't her biological mother, she let her own daughter go to college while her stepdaughter had to get married early. Was that what he meant by pitiful? Now that I told the truth, not only did I embarrass Yvette, but Lance also looked at me in confusion. Yvette said it was because your mother wanted you to study that she made her get married early so. Lance hadn't finished speaking when Yvette interrupted him eagerly. I looked at the people whose expressions had changed and curled my lips. Yvette, I really wanted to see if Lance would still think you were pitiful after knowing your true face. Yvette was hurriedly explaining something to Lance over there. I didn't pay any more attention to the two of them and started to wash the rice and cook. Lance quickly came over to help. He whispered, it turns out that I've been blaming you all along. My hands that were chopping the meat paused. Then I sneered. It seemed that Yvette had indeed told him something behind my back, and this man actually believed her words. Otherwise, he wouldn't think that he had blamed me wrongly now. Before all the dishes were on the table, Eddie almost ate up all the meat. Sister, why did you only buy so little meat? Eddie doesn't have enough to eat. I had to admit that Yvette had really thick skin. After being exposed by me, she soon acted as if nothing had happened. As soon as she finished speaking, her son Eddie quickly nodded. I frowned. It's okay. If it's not enough, I'll take you out to eat something later. Lance quickly smoothed things over. I vaguely remembered that it was the same in my previous life. Before the dishes were on the table, they were all eaten up by Eddie. What was my mood back then? I should have been happy, right? Happy that Eddie liked my cooking. I also thought that he had a good appetite, which was really nice. But now, I just felt disgusted. I picked up my own bowl. Guests should have the self-awareness of being guests, don't you think? I looked straight at Yvette. She paused and then looked at Lance pitifully. Lance paused for a moment and surprisingly didn't protect her as he used to. Instead, he picked up some food for me. Hurry up and eat. I silently pushed the chopsticks with the food aside and didn't touch it. After eating a few mouthfuls of rice, I said again, I've already rented a dormitory room for you. You can stay there for one night and then go back. I definitely wouldn't marry Lance. Since Lance and I were going to break up, it wasn't appropriate for Yvette to continue staying here. Of course, after we divorced, if the two of them still got involved with each other, I wouldn't care and didn't want to care either. Yvette was very excited. She didn't understand why she had to stay in a dormitory when she came to her sister's house. She started crying. I know you've never liked me since we were kids. I also know that you've looked down on me since you went to college. Yes, I've embarrassed you, but I was young and ignorant back then. Couldn't you be more understanding? I'm not leaving. Why should I leave? Yvette started to play the rogue. Lance stood silently by without saying a word. In the past, he would definitely have protected her. I scooped up the rice in my bowl and said faintly, "Your crying and fussing are useless. You'll stay in the dormitory tonight and go back tomorrow. I'll go out to buy the tickets in a while." Seeing that I didn't seem to be joking, Yvette pursed her lips unhappily. After the meal, Eddie also started pestering me, saying that he didn't want to go back. I just looked at him faintly, and he subconsciously let go of my hand. Children are actually the most sensitive. In my previous life, he knew that I liked him very much, so he could act coquettishly with me without any scruples. Now, he also clearly sensed my indifference towards him, so he didn't pester me like he did in my previous life. I just didn't expect that while I was still thinking about how to send them back, Lance came to me first after the meal. "It's not safe for your sister, a woman with a child, to stay at home. Let them stay at home." Seeing that I didn't say anything, he continued, "If you think it's inappropriate for us to share a room since we haven't held the wedding yet, you can sleep in my room and I'll go to the dormitory, okay?" I looked at the man in front of me and felt a pang of sadness in my heart. I knew that Yvette must have gone to beg him again when she saw that I wouldn't give in. I vaguely remembered my previous life. Once, Yvette and I took the child to buy clothes. Both she and I liked a certain piece of clothing. But he said naturally, "Give it to Yvette if she likes it. She's your sister. Let her have it." It seemed that just because I was the older sister, it was my original sin. Yvette still stayed at home in the end. She even stayed in Lance's room. I looked at the receipt for the dormitory room in my pocket, sneered, tore it up and threw it into the trash can. Early the next morning, Lance seemed to know that I was unhappy and made breakfast early before going to work. And Yvette seemed to be afraid that I would drive her away. She had been hiding in the room since daytime and didn't come out until Lance got off work. I ignored the two of them, ate my meal and then went back to my room to start packing. Outside the room, Eddie was jumping and bouncing around in the living room, either shouting loudly or asking Lance to play with him. Lance accompanied him patiently. I listened to the noises outside irritably and tried my best to endure them. While I was packing, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened the door, Lance was outside. "Yvonne, I've already written all the wedding invitations. Look at your family," Lance said. Then he saw the packed bundles behind me. "Why are you packing?" Before I could say anything, Yvette came over with red eyes. "Sister, do you really dislike me that much? If you really want me to leave then I'll leave. I know you think I'm embarrassing you by bringing Eddie along. But do you think I wanted it? I was young back then and was cheated by a man. I was also in great pain. Do you know what people around me thought of me? Do you want to force us mother and son to die?" Yvette wiped her tears and ran out with Eddie. I saw that Lance subconsciously wanted to chase after them. "Lance," I called out. He stopped in his tracks and looked back at me. "Lance, if you chase after them, we'll get divorced," I said faintly. He looked at me in disbelief. "Yvonne? What did you say?" I repeated it again. Lance shook his head in disbelief. "That's your sister. Didn't you hear that she said she would die?" I shrugged. "Then let her die." Lance shook his head and looked at me in disbelief. "Even if you don't like your sister, what about Eddie? Didn't you like Eddie the most before?" Lance paused for a moment. "You once told me that Eddie was very cute and that you could raise him if your sister gave him to you. Have you forgotten all of this?" Of course, I hadn't forgotten. And it was engraved in my heart. How my sincere feelings were betrayed in my previous life, how could I forget that? I said again, "Lance, Yvette told you that my mother was not good to her, and you believed her. I told you not to interfere with her. Do you know why?" Lance opened his mouth, wanting to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Because she has feelings for you. Because she doesn't care that you're her brother-in-law and still tries to get close to you. What about you?" I thought that no matter what the reason was for Lance to be with Yvette in my previous life. But in this life, none of that had happened yet. So, I wanted to see what you, Lance, would do. Sure enough, the first thing I saw was that he subconsciously avoided my gaze. I understood. It turned out that from the very beginning, he knew what Yvette was thinking. There might even have been something between them behind my back without my knowledge. Only me. I was still naively thinking that this man didn't know Yvette's thoughts. Just because she was my sister, he cared about her and took good care of her. At this moment, my heart died. In my previous life, I didn't get the answers and was full of confusion. Now I understood everything. Lance first avoided my sight, seemed to organize his words a little, and then said, "Yvonne, what are you talking about? Yvette is your sister. You know what a woman's reputation means. Think about it carefully yourself." Lance still took his coat and chased after them. I watched the closed door and continued packing my things. The next day, I went to the research institute on time with my luggage. At the beginning of this outdoor archaeological project, the teacher didn't attach much importance to it. But after we had a bumpy journey for a day and a night and arrived at the destination, the teacher realized the seriousness of the situation. He speculated that the burial complex here must be much larger than what had been discovered so far, so we quickly threw ourselves into the work. At night, after a day's work, we were so tired that we fell asleep as soon as we lay down. But in the middle of the night, my female classmate in the same tent and I seemed to hear quite a lot of noise outside. We wanted to get out of the tent, but we were stopped by the male classmates on guard outside. He told us not to go out. That night, I was on tenterhooks all night. The next day we learned that it turned out that some people had sneaked into the tomb last night. There were 3 of them. 1 escaped, but 2 were caught. After a while, I saw the police come and take them away. After that, armed police were on guard nearby every day. And I gradually got used to the work here. Half a year later, the excavation work here came to an end for the time being. Next, many places needed to ask local farmers for help because the burial complex was really too large. The current stage of the excavation work could come to a temporary end. The teacher was going back and asked me if I wanted to go with him. I thought about it and nodded. It was time to settle the matter between Lance and me. Half a year ago, when I left, I told Lance about going to northern Shaanxi with my teacher. He didn't know our specific location, so naturally he couldn't contact me. I had never written to him either. On the way back in the car, I was drowsy. I was thinking about the matter between Lance and me. Thinking about the unwillingness of being deceived in my previous life. Thinking about my plans for the future. I swayed in the car, feeling dizzy and having a headache. When we arrived at the place, I realized belatedly that I must have had a fever. When I got back to the place where I lived, there was no one at home. I habitually pushed open the door of my room, but saw that the room was full of Lance's things. Suddenly, I remembered that day when Yvette said, "However, I like the other room just now better. The window was bigger." I thought to myself, could it be that Yvette hadn't left at all in the past 6 months? It seemed to confirm my thoughts. When I pushed open the door of the room that originally belonged to Lance, I found that the curtains in the room had been changed to pink at some point. The quilt and quilt cover on the bed were also pink and blue, and there were many new toys in the room. Snacks were also all over the table. It seemed that Lance knew that Yvette liked this room, so he even gave up the room for her. I smiled sarcastically. I sat in the living room waiting for them to come back. "Brother-in-law, thank you for your trouble. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting for so long." "It's okay. It's not safe for you, a girl, to get off work so late. And I also want to thank you for finding me a job. You don't know how envious everyone is of me working in the state-owned restaurant." Yvette subconsciously looked up when she saw that Lance hadn't entered the door, but saw that I was looking at them faintly. "Sister, you're back?" Yvette glanced at Lance and then said hesitantly. Lance seemed to react at this moment. He walked in surprised. "Yvonne, you're back. Well, you two talk. I'll go pick up Eddie." Yvette turned around, paused for a moment, and then continued walking out. "Sit," I said faintly as I looked at him. Lance put away his smile and we sat there in silence. Beside us, the luggage I brought back was still at my feet. Lance wanted to say something, but I interrupted him. "Lance, let's forget about our engagement." He suddenly stood up. "What did you say?" I also stood up. "Let's forget about our engagement." I picked up my luggage and was about to leave, but he stopped me. He was full of confusion. "Why? Why do you suddenly want to call it off? Could it be that you've fallen in love with someone else?" After Lance said that, he looked as if he had been cuckolded, and the corners of his eyes turned red. I sighed. I carefully looked at this man whom I had truly loved in my previous life. It turned out that without the halo of love, he was just so. Ordinary, with 2 eyes and a mouth. I didn't want to get too entangled with him, so I simply made it clear all at once. "Lance, what were you thinking when you kept Yvette here after I left?" Lance was puzzled at first, and then suddenly realized, as if he was greatly relieved. "So you said that because of Yvette?" Lance said that and was about to reach for my hand, but I avoided it. He sighed, looked at me affectionately, as if I was a woman who was throwing a tantrum. "Yvette is your sister. After you left, she had nowhere to go by herself, so she could only stay here." He paused for a moment. "Are you angry? Are you angry that I didn't come back the day before you left?" "That's because she ran out that day, and I spent half the night looking for her. She was afraid to come back because she was afraid you would scold her, so I—" "Uncle." Eddie's voice came from outside the door. As soon as he appeared, he rushed into Lance's arms like a rocket. Lance also skillfully picked him up. To make Eddie happy, he even lifted Eddie up high. Yvette looked at the two of them with a smile in her eyes, and then looked at me again. Sister, I bought some vegetables and came back. My cooking skills are just so. Don't be polite. Yvette gave me a faint smile, took the bag, and went to the kitchen as if she knew the way well. I curled the corners of my mouth. This was implying that I was the guest. I was too lazy to pay attention to her and picked up my luggage and walked out. Yvonne? When I reached the door, Lance chased after me. He tightly grasped my luggage. Yvonne? Where are you going? Since we've finished talking, I'll naturally go back to the dormitory to live. The teacher said that he would go to Beijing City in a few days and asked me to bring the materials and go with him. He knew that I wanted to take the postgraduate entrance examination in Beijing City. This time he took me to Beijing City because he wanted to recommend me to an old classmate of his in Beijing City. I was thinking about things in my mind. I didn't expect Lance to pull my luggage hard. I won't allow you to leave. I wasn't paying attention and fell to the ground. I already had a fever, and with this fall, although I wanted to stand up, I felt dizzy for a while. Yvonne. Lance reached out to help me, but I avoided him. I supported myself on the door frame and stood up. I don't want to quarrel with you. You know that there's no possibility between us anymore. Lance shook his head. I waited for you for half a year. You left without a word for half a year. I didn't blame you at all, but you wanted to cancel the engagement as soon as you came back? Yvonne, do you have a heart? As soon as he finished speaking, Lance went inside and slammed the door. I shook my head and slowly walked downstairs, supporting myself on the wall. When I got to the dormitory and put down my luggage, I then went to the clinic and got a few pills. Then I slept drowsily until noon the next day. When I woke up and found that my fever had gone down, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was just about to go and get something to eat when I opened the door and saw Lance at the door. His eyes were red and he looked as if he hadn't slept all night. I took 2 steps back and let him in. For a while, we just looked at each other without saying a word. After a long while, he smiled bitterly. Yvonne, I never thought that you would abandon me. I looked at him faintly and didn't say anything. Yvonne, I know that you mind your sister. I just didn't expect that you would mind so much. He smiled bitterly. I've already told your sister that I'll find a house and let her move out. I won't let her stay here anymore. Lance looked at me, as if he had made a big decision for me. I remembered my previous life. She also lived with us for 3 years. Later, I was really impatient with her wearing my clothes and casually entering my room. It was also Lance who noticed my unhappiness, and then Yvette moved out. What I didn't know was that, in my previous life, when Yvette moved out, Lance rented a house for her outside and supported her. I looked at Lance. Do you want to have your cake and eat it too and enjoy the pleasures of having 2 women at the same time? Lance's eyes widened. What did you say? I sneered. Otherwise, why would you let her move out and still rent a good house for her? How long are you planning to rent it for? A month? A year? Or a lifetime? I watched Lance's face turn pale little by little. I once again mercilessly exposed his thoughts. You said you wanted to be child-free, but you treasured Yvette's child so much that you almost treated him as your own. You wanted to marry me, but at the same time you wanted to rent a house to support her. Lance, you want everything. Why? Is it because your salary is just a few dollars more than mine? Or is it because of your disgusting and dirty dark thoughts of wanting both sisters? Lance wanted to refute, but I slapped him. This slap was for what he owed me in my previous life. I opened the door. Get out. Yvonne. Lance sat there without moving and still wanted to explain. I sneered, with disgust in my eyes. Lance, you really make me sick. Lance's face turned pale. You say I'm sick? Why did I take care of Yvette? Wasn't it because Yvette was your sister? If Yvette wasn't your sister, why would I be so good to her? After Lance said that, his face softened a little. Yvonne. I didn't want to hear what he had to say anymore and directly closed the door and left the dormitory. It wasn't until I had walked 2 streets away that I felt a little relieved. If Lance had really told me that he was being fickle and had feelings for Yvette, I would have thought a little better of him. At least he would have had the courage to take responsibility for what he did. But he was using the pretext of doing it for my good while getting involved with Yvette. It really disgusted me. This made me, who originally didn't want to get too entangled with them, suddenly not want to let them off so easily. After eating, when I went back to the dormitory, I deliberately walked around the street corner. The aunties who were chatting idly at the street corner after having an early dinner saw me and all curiously came up to me, asking why they hadn't seen me during this period of time. I wiped the corners of my eyes and said that I hadn't been around during this period. The aunties' expressions changed instantly. One of them came up to me and looked at me seriously. You said you hadn't been around during this period? I nodded. Then was the person living in your house during this period really your own sister? I looked up, hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. Yvonne, you have to tell the truth. Is she really your own sister? You can't fool us. Another auntie also nodded. I've seen Dr. Gu and her going around together during this period. If she's not your own sister, this is a big deal. I quickly explained, yes. She's my stepsister. A stepsister can also be considered a sister, right? I looked up and asked everyone for confirmation. Everyone was quiet for a while, and then someone asked me, why aren't you at home? Where are you going? I paused for a moment, and tears fell again. There's no room for me at home, so I'm temporarily staying in the dormitory. After I said that, I looked at everyone with a hesitant expression and then covered my mouth and ran away. There were still people calling me from behind. I rushed back to the dormitory in one breath and then drank a lot of water. Humph. Lance, you still want to enjoy the pleasures of having two women at the same time in this life. Just wait and see. That night, Lance came over again. As soon as he saw me, he looked at me with a complicated expression. What's the matter? I frowned. Yvonne, I said that there's nothing between me and Yvette. What did you say outside? Lance paused for a moment before saying. Before I could say anything, he said in a slightly hurried tone, someone made a fuss at the restaurant and said that she was a vixen who drove away her own sister. The hospital also talked to me, Yvonne. Lance looked at me disapprovingly. Even if Yvette isn't your own sister, she grew up with you. You can't just watch her lose her job, can you? What do you want to do? I asked curiously. Lance's eyes lit up. Yvonne, you go to the restaurant and explain. Just say that it was all a misunderstanding. He took out another ring and said, we're about to get married. Look, this is the ring I bought for you. Yvonne, come back with me. How can it be as comfortable living in the dormitory as at home? I know you mind Yvette. I can ask her to leave. I also know that you might be a bit bothered by my decision of not wanting children. But it doesn't matter. If you want to have a child, we can have one. Or, if you want to take Yvette's child to raise, that's okay too. Don't worry. I will surely treat him as, get out. I couldn't bear it anymore. On the third day, I went to the state-owned restaurant. Yvette thought that I had come to plead for her and trotted over to take my hand. Sister, it was brother-in-law who asked you to come, right? Oh, he's always like this. I've already said it's not necessary, but he's still worried about me. Slap. Yvette was slapped so hard that she was stunned. Even the manager was startled. I looked at Yvette and said, you clearly knew that I was going to marry Lance. I asked you to stay in the dormitory, but you refused. I left angrily because of this for half a year. But when I came back, you were so good that you even occupied my room. What? Can't you live without a man? Or do you think it's more exciting to steal someone else's man? As soon as I finished speaking, everyone present started talking in an uproar. Yvette covered her face flushed red. You? I didn't. You're slandering me. I wouldn't spoil her. You also asked your brother-in-law not to have children and wanted us to adopt your out-of-wedlock child. Yvette, you're really something. The people around were in an uproar again. No matter how Yvette tried to defend herself, no one believed her anymore. Of course, I knew that Lance's idea of being child-free was his own decision. But that didn't stop me from putting the blame on Yvette at all. After this incident, Yvette couldn't stay here anymore. She sadly packed her things and was about to leave. I followed her back. When she saw me, she was furious. What enmity do I have with you? Why don't you let me have an easy life? Why? You clearly know that Brother Lance's decision of not wanting children was his own idea. Why did you blame me for it? I'm your sister. How can you be so vicious? Yvette looked at me with red eyes full of anger in her eyes. I looked at her faintly. Yes. I'm your sister. What enmity do we have that you tried to steal my man? Yvette opened her mouth but finally didn't say anything and was about to leave. Wait a minute. She turned around. What else do you want? Fine, I'm sorry to you, okay? I'll leave, okay? What else do you want? Yvette threw her luggage aside and roared hysterically. I gave her a faint look and then asked, are you really willing to leave like this? She was stunned. What do you mean? I slowly sat down. You came here for Lance, didn't you? Are you really willing to leave like this? She looked at me without saying a word. I took my bag and went out, standing in front of her. If I were you, I definitely wouldn't be willing to leave so easily. I would make a scene. I would say that he had improper intentions towards me and that we had already been in a relationship like husband and wife. After all, it's almost impossible to find another man as good as him once you miss him. What do you think? After hearing my words, Yvette gave me an uncertain look and then lowered her head. I stayed in the dormitory for one night and then went to Beijing City with my teacher the next day. Since then, all these messy and unpleasant things here have been far away from my life. Extra, Lance Yvonne and I met at a friend's party. I fell in love with her at first sight. Later, through a friend's introduction, we officially got to know each other. I had never thought that Yvonne and I would separate in this lifetime. The problems between us probably started after our relationship was confirmed and I met her family. Because we were discussing our marriage, her mother brought her sister to visit several times. It was then that I learned that her sister wasn't her biological sister. But she was quite lovely. After having a child, she still seemed very innocent and pure. It turned out that Yvette didn't study because the family could only afford to support one person to study. However, I only learned later that all of this was Yvette's lie. She didn't even know who the father of her child was. After Yvonne left, she went to the hospital where I worked to make a fuss, saying that I had already had an intimate relationship with her. I was extremely angry. I spent a long time explaining, but the hospital still asked me to go home and think about it, hinting that I should handle the family matters before coming back to work. When I got home, I asked Yvette why she slandered me. There was nothing between her and me. But the originally cute and sensible little sister showed her sharp and ugly side for the first time. She said, "Stop pretending. If you weren't interested in me, how could you let me live with you alone? If you didn't have other ideas, why would you be willing to rent a house for me outside?" Later, she said, "If you don't marry me, I'll report you." I hesitated. The reason why we barely managed to keep our jobs this time was mainly because of my identity as a returnee from abroad. I looked at this woman who I used to think was charming and lovely but now was full of greed and shook my head. Only then did I realize that I was really wrong. Some people and some things should never be touched. I wanted to beg Yvonne for forgiveness. But when I went to the dormitory, I learned that she had already left. Last time, I knew where she had gone. But this time, she just disappeared from my life. I struggled with Yvette for more than half a month and finally gave in. I had to marry her. Otherwise, I would have no future. However, how could my wife be a woman who got involved with a man when she was only 14 or 15 years old and even gave birth to an illegitimate child? But I found that I had to swallow this bitterness. At this time, my mother-in-law contacted Yvonne to come back to handle the divorce procedures. When I saw Yvonne again, I learned that she had gone to Beijing City. On the day Yvonne came back to handle the divorce procedures, she left immediately. I chased after her. I wanted to ask her how she had been in the past year. I wanted to know if there was still a chance for us, but when I chased after her, I didn't see her at all. Because of this, Yvette quarreled with me again. She said that I was greedy and wanted both. Later, after we had been married for 7 or 8 years, she didn't get pregnant. It was then that I learned that she had already damaged her body when giving birth to Eddie and could never get pregnant again. I was a bit dejected. It was okay when I didn't want children myself. But when she couldn't have children because of her promiscuous behavior, I definitely couldn't accept it. Since then, we slept in separate rooms. I couldn't accept such a dirty body lying beside me day and night. Eddie had grown up. I paid for him to get married and have children. But after all, he wasn't my biological child. Before marriage, it was okay. But after marriage, he moved out with his wife. He didn't even make a phone call for months. Even when I was sick and hospitalized, he just came to see me in a hurry and then left. At this time, I realized what kind of person I had been raising for so many years. Later, on my mother-in-law's 70th birthday, I finally saw Yvonne again. She hadn't changed much. Her black hair was straight, and her complexion was ruddy. She looked almost the same as she did 20 or 30 years ago. She came back with her husband. Yvonne, who once promised to be child-free with me, now had a son and a daughter. Her husband seemed to be very kind to her. When she saw me, she nodded, with no emotion in her eyes. My eyes turned red. Yvonne. I regretted it. My whole life. It shouldn't have been like this. The end.